Hello everyone, welcome to my video discussing the different race choices for Warlock in Classic WoW. This video is covering the Horde race choices, and my next video will be covering Alliance races. The goal of this video is to discuss the races for Warlock in relation to the new Anniversary realms that are transitioning to TBC and most likely Wrath of the Lich King as well. The focus of this video will be PvP, however PvE will be discussed as well. In the background I have some gameplay footage to keep y'all entertained hopefully, as this audio is recorded separately. But with that said, let's get into the information. So for Classic WoW you have two choices for Warlock, and that is Orc or Undead. As you can see, my Warlock is Orc, and I will discuss why in this video. I made this character with the goal of playing them in Classic, TBC, and Wrath, and I still chose Orc. But I don't think Undead is a bad choice by any means, and I will discuss the pros and cons between them. So starting with Classic WoW, let's look at the impactful ratios for Warlock between Orc and Undead. I will not spend a lot of time discussing less impactful racial differences such as base stat differences, Blood Fury which is just attack power, axe skill, underwater breathing, or 10 shadow resist. The main talking point between Orc and Undead is the 25% stun resistance and 5% pet damage for Orcs versus Cannibalize and Will of the Forsaken for Undead. So let's start with Orc. Let's think about when in PvP you may be getting stunned, and a 25% chance to resist it is impactful. The first thought everyone probably has is rogues. Resisting cheap shot and kidney shot can be very detrimental for the rogue and very much turn the tide of battle. So much so that many rogues will prioritize fighting other races or change their playstyle versus orcs and not even go for stuns. Orc certainly makes the rogue matchup much easier, but there's also Hammer of Justice from Paladin. Resisting a 6-second stun can be huge. Resisting a warrior charge or intercept stun can be very helpful as well. If you resist that stun and are able to deny the hamstring, it makes it much easier to evade them. Those are probably the big ones, but there are other stuns such as grenades, Tidal Charm, Druid Bash, BM Hunter's Intimidation, and Tauren War Stomp if you're dueling. All of these have a 25% chance to resist as an Orc. Also, Orc have 5% increased pet damage. Not terribly impactful, but I feel like it's worth mentioning. Particularly for PvE, if you're playing SM Ruin instead of DS Ruin and have your Imp out, on some fights where the Imp isn't at risk to AoE, you can get the benefit of a slightly more powerful Imp, which is nice. On the other note, let's look at what Undead get, being Will of the Forsaken and Cannibalize. Cannibalize I find to be more of a leveling racial. There are some instances in World PvP where Cannibalize can be helpful if a nearby mob is dead, or if you're 2v1ing and kill one opponent, then you can Cannibalize them to get some extra health. But as a rule, I don't put a lot of value in Cannibalize for Warlock. But Will of the Forsaken is amazing, and probably the biggest reason most people pick Undead Warlock. It's a 2-minute cooldown that breaks Fear, Sleep, and Charm effects, and makes you immune to them for 5 seconds. Similar to the Orc stun resistance, let's talk about where this is most impactful. First is the Warlock versus Warlock matchup. Since the Alliance don't have a similar racial to Will of the Forsaken, if you are an Undead Warlock, you automatically have a pretty sizable advantage versus every Warlock that isn't also Undead, being every Alliance Warlock and also Orcs on the Horde. Another notable matchup is Priest, which can be a problem class for Warlock sometimes. Priest Fear is on a cooldown unlike Warlock Fear, so breaking out of the Priest Fear is huge, as it can't simply re-fear after the 5-second immunity is over, like a Warlock could. There are also some less common Fear, Sleep, and Charm effects such as Warrior Fear, Succubus Seduction, or Magic Dust. But now that we've gone over the main benefits between the Orc Stun Resist and Undead Will of the Forsaken, let's talk about which is better. In my opinion, I believe that in Classic WoW the Orc is superior, but Undead is still a great choice. I find more value in the chance to resist all the stuns that every single class in the game has access to through engineering items or trinkets, as well as built-in class-specific stuns. One reason for that is because, unlike every other version of WoW, in Classic WoW, each class's PvP trinket only removes 3 things, and the Warlock trinket is one of the few that does not include stun. So without a living action potion, which isn't even in the game yet, a Warlock has no way to get out of a stun other than dispelling Hodge with your Fell Hunter. Whereas the PvP trinket does get you out of fear. So even without Will of the Forsaken, you do have the ability to get out of fear with that trinket. Another thing of note is that when fighting an Alliance Warlock as an Orc, you're not at a disadvantage like an Alliance Warlock is versus Undeads. You're simply not at an advantage. So if you're an Orc and you lose the 1v1 to a Gnome or Human, it's really a skill issue because neither of you have Will of the Forsaken. So you can't really get mad if you get outplayed. However, if I played an Alliance Warlock and I lost to an Undead who I felt I outplayed but didn't have Will of the Forsaken, I may get tilted. Overall, I feel that there are more numerous stuns in the game, and seeing as Warlock has no built-in way to get out of stun, I find the 25% stun resistance more impactful than Will of Forsaken that mainly helps versus other Warlocks and Priests. For PvE, Undead have a clear advantage versus the bosses that fear, such as Onyxia and Magmadar, but on any boss that doesn't fear, if the Warlock is playing SM Rune with an Imp out, the Orc has that 5% pet damage ratio that, while it's not much, is a DPS increase. But now that I've discussed Classic WoW, let's look at the Orc and Undead's racial changes in TBC, as well as the different environment being Arena. Note that I will not be discussing Blood Elf Warlocks, as the goal of this video is to inform you on what you may want to choose on the new Classic WoW Anniversary servers with TBC and Wrath in mind. If you want to play a Blood Elf Warlock, you have no way of doing so at the moment. But let's get into the Orc changes and the Undead changes. Undead first, very quick because there's no notable change in TBC. Will of the Forsaken is still a 2-minute cooldown that breaks Fear, Charm, and Sleep effects and makes you immune for 5 seconds. However, Orcs do get some notable changes. One notable buff and one notable nerf. The buff being that the previously useless racial Blood Fury that just granted attack power in Classic also now grants spell power, making this a noteworthy DPS cooldown. However, do still note that it gives a temporary Mortal Strike effect, so you do want to be careful when using this ability. However, the notable nerf is to the 25% stun resist, which is now a 15% stun resist. Still nice to have, but certainly a nerf. Now let's discuss whether Orc or Undead is better in TBC for Warlock. I would say that the advent of Arena definitely influences your decision. In my opinion, unlike Classic, I would say that Undead slightly outperforms Orc in TBC. Blood Fury has that Mortal Strike effect really limiting its use case, and the 10% nerf on stun resistance really hurts, though it's still quite useful. As a Warlock, you may find yourself being the kill target in many comps, and the stun resist can certainly help you survive the massive amount of rogues and warriors who will be trying to kill you. However, there are also many priests and warlocks in Arena, and I found that the reliable Will of the Forsaken is simply more useful than the stun resist chance. So with that said, I think Undead is better, but Orc are still quite strong in TBC. Finally, assuming that these realms move on to Wrath of the Lich King, let's look at the changes. So overall, both the Undead and the Orc racials get a nerf in my opinion. First, the Orc has 2 notable changes, one buff and one nerf. The buff is that Blood Fury, which started giving spell power in TBC, still does so, but the Mortal Strike debuff is removed, so you can now use this racial without any downside. However, the Orcs don't get off too easy because the 15% stun resistance from TBC gets changed to 15% stun duration reduction. Still a nice racial, but certainly a downside overall. Now let's look at the Undead changes, which the most impactful one is certainly to the change to Will of the Forsaken. It gets nerfed in 2 ways. Firstly, Will of the Forsaken no longer gives any short-term immunity to Fear, Charm, and Sleep effects. It simply breaks you out of them. Secondly, it now shares a cooldown with your PvP trinket. Using Will of the Forsaken puts your PvP trinket on a 45-second cooldown even if you haven't used your PvP trinket yet. Similarly, if you PvP trinket, your Will of Forsaken is now on a 45-second cooldown even if it hasn't been used. So if you are Undead, Will of Forsaken is certainly useful, but you have to be mindful that if you use it to break a fear, your opponents will know that you cannot trinket for the next 45 seconds, which makes you a prime kill target. Personally, I would say that Orc and Undead are pretty evenly matched in the Wrath of the Lich King for PvP. It's either the nerfed version of Will of the Forsaken or the Orc with the on-use spell damage increase and the 15% stun duration reduction. Overall, if you're making a Warlock in these Anniversary realms, you can't go wrong between Orc and Undead. Both are awesome. In my opinion, Orc is slightly stronger in Classic, Undead is slightly stronger in TBC, and in Wrath I feel they are quite evenly matched. Personally, with all 3 expansions in mind, I decided to go Orc. But thank you for watching the video, and I hope to see more Orc Warlocks out in the world rather than all these Undeads. I'll see y'all in the next video covering Alliance races. Thank you.